Hi, my name is Frances Marsh, though most people know me as Frankie, and I'm going to talk today about critical information literacy and decolonisation based on some research that I carried out for my MA dissertation in Library and Information Studies. So to give an overview of this talk, I'll start by explaining why I think we should be including IL in libraries' approaches to decolonising the curriculum and introducing critical information literacy a little bit. I'll explain the methodology for my qualitative research with academics and then move straight onto some recommendations or kind of provocations that emerged from my findings before concluding with this idea of unsettling information literacy. So I don't want to go into too much detail at the start about decolonisation and decolonising the curriculum itself, but I do want to just start by referencing Tuck and Yang's really powerful and important assertion that decolonisation is not a metaphor. So they see educational establishments' use of curricula and pedagogy to engender critical consciousness actually as a form of settler harm reduction, where decolonisation for them is a particular issue of stolen land. And I just wanted to set the tone with this idea so that we can remember why we're doing this work and the deep-rooted injustices that it is aiming to address. That said, I think the editors of Decolonizing the University, this edited collection, do a really good job of explaining why decolonisation is important for universities to address, and in a UK context as well. So they say that Western universities are key sites where colonial knowledge is consecrated, institutionalised and naturalised, and decolonisation, as the quote on screen shows, kind of aims to transform this. So in the past few years, decolonising the curriculum has become both a hot and contentious topic within UK higher education, and academic libraries have really started to recognise the role that they can play. In general, however, this work has predominantly been focused on diversifying collections, from campaigns to get students involved in suggesting new book purchases, to developing codes and algorithms to statistically analyse the diversity of reading lists. But this quote from Dave Hudson explains why these kind of approaches might be problematic. So the presence of underrepresented works in a library does not ensure their agency per se. Presence alone poses no structural challenge to the research and curricular knowledge frameworks within which the works are used or altogether ignored. And I think in libraries, we've basically neglected to think about our educational possibilities for the decolonisation project more holistically and specifically in exercising information literacy teaching and approaches. So on the one hand, this research was thinking about the kind of potential for IL and how to include it in our work with students and academics to decolonise the curriculum. But on the other, it's also about examining IL through a decolonial lens with an eye to its colonial attributes and thinking about how we can integrate decolonial considerations into our own IL praxis. So a big chunk of the literature that informed my research was about the coloniality of libraries and of information literacy. But I'm hoping that we can discuss that together in the seminar element after this. So I'm going to move on now to just talk a little bit about critical IL, which is an approach that I thought was particularly fitting for scaffolding a decolonial relationship with information and processes of knowing, because it takes into account power structures when we're talking about information and the kind of socio-political dynamics of information and student learning. So these kind of things seem really promising for directly addressing some of the issues that we're talking about with decolonising the curriculum. And yet there was a lot of really pertinent criticism of critical information literacy and some of its kind of key foundational texts, in that they more often tended to address issues of capitalism and neoliberalism than colonialism or racial capitalism explicitly. So there's clearly more that needs to be done to connect the potential of critical IL with decolonisation. So in terms of my research, recognising the pivotal role that academics play in the way that information is produced, used, circulated, and woven into course design, and having noticed that there isn't much in the literature around engaging academics with critical IL, I worked with 5 academic researchers to explore the potential for critical IL in decolonial work and ask them what IL might look like from a decolonial perspective, in their opinion. So to be involved, the researchers all had to have some sort of interest in decolonising the curriculum. And although they came from a variety of different institutions at different career stages, 4 of the 5 were from geography. The topic of decolonisation is an emergent theme and quite complex. So interviews were a really productive way at kind of getting at their experiences and ideas, and reactions to a definition of critical IL that I'd given them in advance to have a look at. So yeah, the discussion was really, really productive. I transcribed all of the interviews and then used that as the raw data. So I used a manual open coding process to kind of name ideas and then iteratively worked with those codes to group and synthesize the themes, also within a theoretical framework. So I used the 3 core processes of decolonising the university, according to Ikatha and Bathgeth at the University of Amsterdam, to kind of structure my findings. So those 3 core processes are positionality, relationality, and transitionality. Positionality means that all knowledge is taught as situated. Relationality involves a transformation of the power relationships and exclusions in the classroom and across the university. And transitionality is about encouraging students to question the meaning of the knowledge they learn and kind of thinking about the wider implications of education beyond university. So my findings reveal that in an effort to decolonize the curriculum, critical IL might usefully facilitate positionality, practice relationality, and consider transitionality. And then from these 3 themes, or 3 processes, I came up with a series of actually 6 provocations. I'm only going to address 5 here. They're not solutions, they're probably just starting points for thinking about how we can generate the potential for decolonisation in the way that we teach and think about IL in academic libraries. So I'm going to address each of these 5 points in turn and highlight some of the key findings illustrated with participant quotations as well. So the first one is to embrace the value of non-traditional and non-textual information. So information literacy in academic libraries has traditionally dealt with what Bell Hooks calls book knowledge. But to pave the way for decolonising the curriculum, IL must be unsettled to recognise that information comes in many social, embodied, material and non-academic forms, including oral, visual, musical and object-based information, lived experience and through interactions with people. This research made clear that academic researchers are already really interested in encouraging students to critically engage with non-traditional and non-academic forms of information, as the first quote here shows. The second quote is about the value of field trips in geography. So that's obviously something specific to this discipline, but I think in general, our approaches to IL are so rooted in textual information that we neglect to think about the social, experiential and embodied information that emerged in this research as a really significant element of a decolonised information literacy. So the participants also talked about things to do with trying to kind of destabilise, disrupt, decenter and create a sensation of difference as really important elements of a decolonial relationship with information. So, for example, one interviewee talked about showing like a tactile wooden carving that depicts the geography of a coastline made by Indigenous people alongside a paper-based map to kind of highlight the radically different representations of space and show that both are situated types of knowledge. Both are located geopolitically, and that's what this idea of positionality is trying to get at, that everything is situated, all types of knowledge, all forms. Beyond thinking about how we help learners to discover and think about information that goes beyond Anglo-American publishing models and the kind of canonical Eurocentric knowledge and textual information that is deemed academic, I think the other aspect of this is about initiating more sensitive conversations about evaluating the information. So this quote from participant B really nicely illustrates what they hope for students to appreciate in terms of a decolonial approach to information literacy, so that all sources of knowledge about the world are situated, impartial, and influenced by these wider dynamics of coloniality. And one of the really interesting pedagogical methods that emerged in this research was, amongst various participants, was the value of gap finding. So actually asking students to critique the information they're presented with in reading lists or curricula. And this was done kind of very informally in the middle of lectures and seminars, kind of asking like what's missing here, whose perspective is missing, but also embedded in part of the final assessment for a course on post-colonial and decolonial geography. And this idea of gap finding also really neatly demonstrates where critical IL could contribute to decolonisation. One of the participants explained how the aim isn't just about gap finding, but questioning why certain marginalizations are the way they are and tracing that backwards. So that's a really productive method for librarians to engage in conversations about the kind of power structures underlying information in reading lists. Gaps were also a really significant part of how academics engage with information. So this quote from participant E talks about information which selectively ignores important perspectives because of differences in language. So the third theme that recurred in my interviews was about language in terms of what source material is drawn upon, like in this quote, but also about what language that academics choose to publish in and what they choose to teach with. So an interesting thing that one participant talked about was deliberately including quotes from sources and secondary literature in their original language and not translating them. So drawing attention to the non-English language context of the source, which were actually speeches by Indigenous leaders, kind of centering those marginalized voices and highlighting and then inverting certain relationships of power. So I think this decentering of monolingual English has a disruptive or unsettling effect, which turns it into what Hooks would call more than the oppressor's language. So drawing attention to what we can't access or understand not only encourages to think about the power structures underlying information, but also enables us to learn from those spaces of silence and perhaps experience otherness. And in terms of IL, I think what this means is that we need to start naming language as another relationship of power. So asking questions like, what information do we miss when we're assuming an Anglo-centric information landscape? And remember that when we're promoting monolingualism as both the norm and ideal, we're ignoring manifold different types of information and infinite ways of learning. The findings revealed that uncovering the non-neutrality of libraries is important because there are then a series of implications for working with library information. So once you know that the terminology and classification schemes are biased, that then impacts how you search. Once you start to think about what knowledge libraries don't hold, that then impacts where you look and how you work with the information that you do find. So academic researchers are already thinking about how libraries perpetuate coloniality through knowledge organization, collecting practices, and search result ranking. And these ideas are perhaps unsettling for those of us that work in and with libraries and their resources, but they're necessary for enabling a decolonial approach in research and also in teaching, as this quote from participant D nicely demonstrates. So although the bulk of these findings come under the concept of positionality, it was also clear that the pedagogical kind of purpose and operations in universities are considered just as important as content and information itself for decolonising the curriculum. So in terms of relationality, academics with an interest in decolonisation are attuned to the value of critical pedagogies, in particular more democratic horizontal forms of teaching and learning that value student experience in knowledge creation. So this is also something that we can take on board in our own pedagogies, and working with academics in that. Secondly, the findings reveal significant tensions in the relationship between decolonisation and academic success in relation to both student learning and academic research, and the kind of pressures that are put on academics. So rather than relying on success alone as a framework, reflecting on transitionality and the kind of wider significance and purpose of university knowledge production would be a beneficial approach for exploiting information literacy in decolonising agendas. So ultimately, all of these recommendations or provocations or just themes have the effect of unsettling IL as it has traditionally been understood and practiced in UK academic libraries. This presentation isn't kind of about actionable solutions in the same way that collection development initiatives and reading list statistical analyses are. They might usefully be understood through the lens of what Hudson calls the whiteness of practicality, which means that we remain non-committal in our analysis of how libraries are implicated in perpetuating coloniality. Instead, this is a call to action for experimentation that unsettles information literacy. So on one level, our conception of IL in itself needs to be unsettled to create a decolonial critical information literacy that pays attention to power structures, recognises social and embodied forms of information, and validates diverse information practices. The techniques that emerge in the findings are also designed to unsettle, to be troublesome, whether that be complicating our relationship with the library by drawing attention to its non-neutrality, altering the hierarchical foundations of relationships between learners and educators, creating a sensation of difference in the language of information we present and the representations of knowledge that we juxtapose, or finding gaps in source references, reading lists, and curricula. IL must also remain unsettled in the way that we might understand its potential. So both information literacy and decolonisation in universities have been critiqued for their co-option into neoliberal motives. Their suggested partnership should not become another form of settler harm reduction for academia, to return to Tuck and Yang's statement from the start of this presentation. These are the references, and thank you very much for listening.